morning. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's program. Thank you all for your ongoing viewership and support. We couldn't do this without your help. Please stay tuned to the end of today's program for a brief update on our upcoming programs. We have some terrific programs coming up in September and October. Also, please consider becoming a member. It's a great way to support our organization, and it helps us continue to be able to provide you with this quality programming. You can find out about all of the member benefits on our website at lawacth.org. For those of you who would like to ask Dan questions today, there's a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions. Jessica Ganzik, our Vice President of Events, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program, which will start in about 30 or 35 minutes. It's now my great pleasure to bring our own Professor Dan Schnur on. He has two very meaty topics for you today. Hey, Dan.
Hey, Kim, how are you?
Oh, my goodness. There is no end in sight of all of the topics that we throw at you to have to cover. You have two great topics today. Are we ready for another war on terror? And secondly, California's recall election, lessons for the rest of the country. God bless that we have your program. Thank you. Take it away, Dan. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kim. And thanks to all of you for being with us for another one of our webinars. Just as a reminder, not next week, but 2 weeks from today, on Tuesday, September 14th, we'll be shifting the time of the program, as I think we've mentioned before. We know that many of you have returned to the workplace, either completely or partially. And so instead of doing the program midday like we've been doing for the last year and a half, starting 2 weeks from today, we'll be meeting instead at 5 o'clock Pacific time, 8 o'clock Eastern. And we hope that you'll make the switch with us. And if you have friends or family members who have been out of the house more regularly these days, we hope you let them know about it. But that's still 2 weeks away. So let's talk about today. And topic number one, as Kim mentioned, is are we ready for another war on terrorism? Now, those of you who've been regular participants in our webinars know that I very rarely talk about the same issue 2 weeks in a row. That's because there were so many interesting and important things going on in the nation and the world, but also because the purpose of our program is less about tracking the day-to-day movements and machinations, but rather to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. But Afghanistan is a really, really, really big story. And so that really big picture has led us to talk about it for several weeks now. And we're going to talk about it, maybe not for the last time today, but one more time today. And the reason is because, as I know all of you know, is because America's longest war ended last night. The last US military planes left Kabul's airport at 3:29 p.m. Eastern Time, 12:29 Pacific. That was 11:59 p.m. on Monday night in Kabul. And this marked the end of the US military presence in Afghanistan. And as well, it marked the end of the efforts to airlift thousands of US citizens and vulnerable Afghanis as the country fell to the Taliban. Now, the evacuation of US civilians ended about 12 hours earlier, military officials said, but some Afghans were still being evacuated in the closing hours. The US, by the time all was said and done, the US facilitated the evacuation of over 120,000 people out of Afghanistan, which is believed to be the largest airlift in our military's history. And that included about 5,000 Americans. But there's still between 200 and 300 Americans in Afghanistan who want to leave, who weren't able to get to the airport by Monday night. And of course, as we talked about last week, thousands and thousands of Afghan allies and former workers who are still attempting to leave the country. So like I said, this marks the fourth week in a row that we'll be discussing Afghanistan, but we're trying to discuss it from different perspectives. The week before the US evacuation and the Taliban takeover began, you may remember we compared the challenges our country was facing in Afghanistan versus how we were handling the situation in Iraq. The next week, we talked about the withdrawal itself and the potential challenges it created for the Biden administration, both domestically and internationally. Last week, we shifted our focus to the emerging refugee crisis. And while that certainly hasn't been solved, in fact, we've barely begun to address the scope of bringing and relocating hundreds of thousands of Afghani refugees to the US and to other places around the world. Today, we're gonna, as the title of this topic implies, today, in the wake of the tragedy at the Kabul airport last week, we'll be examining the possible reemergence of the threat of international terrorism. So we're continuing to discuss this critically important story, but each week we've been digging deeper on a different aspect of the crisis, and I hope that all of you, or at least most of you, would agree that it's been a good use of our continuing time and attention, because of course there are plenty of other things, as Kim mentioned, that we need to be talking about both today and in the weeks going forward. All right, so let's talk about the war on terrorism. 20 years ago, next week, Al-Qaeda terrorists hijacked 4 commercial airplanes and flew them into the World Trade Center towers in the Pentagon. And those attacks caused almost 3,000 deaths and more than 25,000 non-fatal injuries. A year later, a year after the September 11th attacks in the fall of 2002, polling showed that roughly 2/3 of Americans believed we would see another terrorist attack of similar scale to September 11th over the next few years. And 2/3 of Americans believed that terrorist attack would cause as much, if not more, death and destruction in the United States. And at that point, a year later, only a little bit less than 1/3 of those polled thought that terrorists were less capable of launching a similar attack than they had on 9/11. So it's hard to remember now, 19 years later, but we were fairly skeptical and to some degree ready, almost accepting of the likelihood of another terrorist attack of that scale, which of course has not taken place. So here we are a couple of decades later, and last week's massacre at the Kabul airport has us thinking about terrorism again, in a way that most of us have not been thinking about it for quite some time. So before we go any further, Claire, I'd like to ask our group the first question, just to get their sense of this topic. So question for all of you: does the US withdrawal from Afghanistan increase the risk of a terrorist attack here in the United States? Option 1, yes, it does increase the risk of terrorism, but it's worth the risk in order to finally end this war. Second, yes, it does increase the risk, so we should be keeping a troop presence there instead of leaving to protect against terrorism. Third, no, it doesn't increase the likelihood of terrorism, so the withdrawal is the right decision. And fourth, finally, for those of you who think this is the answer that makes the most sense to you, no, it doesn't increase the likelihood of terrorism, but we should be staying in Afghanistan anyway, even if only to protect the Afghani people. So Claire, let's see what our group thinks about this question, just to set the stage for our discussion going forward. And oh, wow, look at that. A very, very divided group we have here. 60% of you, if you add up those first 2 categories, believe that the threat of terrorism does increase. 41% say no, and you guys are gonna have to brief me on the math on that a little bit later. But interesting, of those who say that the risk of a terrorist attack in the United States will increase, roughly 2/3 of you say, yes, it is going to increase the threat of terrorism, but that's worth it in order to finally end this war. Only 1/3 of those who do believe that terrorism will increase, or the threat of terrorism will increase, have said, well, because of that continued threat, we should keep troops there. And for those of you who don't believe the threat of terrorism should be increased, not surprisingly, Very large majority say that if the threat of terrorism is not going to increase, then the withdrawal was the right decision. And a very small percentage who believe that even if the threat of terrorism in North America has not increased, we should still be keeping troops there to protect the Afghani people. So split decision here, but roughly 60% of you do agree that this is going to increase the threat of international terrorism. And I have to say, I agree with you. So going forward, though, in this discussion, I think the most important thing that we can do is draw a distinction between local terrorism and global terrorism. The Taliban are terrorists, make no mistake. They were in 2001, and they are now. And despite some of their more conciliatory public statements, there have already been reports in recent weeks that they are committing atrocities again against women and girls in Afghanistan, against ethnic and religious minorities, and against those who've worked with the US or other Western interests over the last 20 years. But this is why the distinction between local and global terrorism is so important for our discussion. Because neither in the years that the Taliban ran Afghanistan, between 1996 and 2001, nor more recently, has Taliban leadership ever voiced goals or acted on goals beyond the borders of their own country. So the Taliban, of course, can be absolutely ruthless in pursuing their enemies, but their international interests are minimal, almost to the point of non-existence. But during their time in power, back in the 90s and early 2000s, the Taliban did host other terrorist organizations with much broader aspirations. We all know that they provided a safe harbor, of course, for Osama bin Laden and for Al-Qaeda in the past, with obvious catastrophic results for the US and for the world. And today, most respected intelligence analysts believe that while the Taliban has no international ambitions, it's very likely that they will allow other terrorists with global ambitions to base their operations in that country again. We saw a horrific example of that last week when the Kabul airport was the target of a deadly terrorist attack run by the ISIS-K offshoot that killed 13 US service members and roughly 200 Afghani civilians. Now, it's not clear how much control the Taliban has over these other groups. The ISIS-K attack at the airport last week does not appear to have involved the Taliban. In fact, it appeared that the Taliban was trying to prevent violence before the August 31st American departure deadline. And so there's now some very strong doubts as to how much control the Taliban will have over the entire country. And large lawless areas is where terrorist groups with global ambitions tend to set up shop. Now, there are also still unanswered questions, even to this day, as to the depth of the relationship and the nature of the relationship between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, both back in the 90s and early 2000s and now. There are some relative optimists, because I think relative optimism is the best you get in these kind of conversations. There are some relative optimists who think that as the Taliban comes to terms with the challenges they face in governing that country, and as they come to realize their need for international financial support to survive, that maybe the Taliban leadership may make some efforts to discourage the larger scale, global focused terrorist activity for which Al-Qaeda and ISIS and others are known. The Taliban's relationship with China, as we discussed last week, depends heavily on their being able to prevent Muslim insurrectionist activity on the Chinese border in a way that would encourage the Uyghurs in Northwest China. And while Russia has indicated their interest in working with the Taliban, that would go away very quickly if Russia began seeing terrorist activity in their client states, like Tajikistan and others in that region. Now, the more pessimistic observers think the Taliban will be able to rely on drug money and trade with Iran and potentially Russia and China to sustain economically, and they won't have to expend a lot of effort on the rest of the world except to sell some of their high-end mineral resources on the black market. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, the ISIS-K airport attack raises the question about whether the Taliban could control the entire country even if they wanted to. So we don't know how much of the re-emerging threat in Afghanistan is being done as a result of Taliban interests or in spite of Taliban interests. But one thing is clear, not only is Afghanistan a more dangerous place than it was a few months ago, but so is the world. Large majorities of Americans agree with both Donald Trump and Joe Biden that it was time for the United States to leave Afghanistan. But we should recognize, as I mentioned earlier, that there has not been a large-scale terrorist attack in the United States since September 11th, despite the expectations that we all had in the aftermath of that tragedy. And a lot of that, not all of it, but a lot of that is because Afghanistan, for the last 20 years, has not been nearly as hospitable a staging area for large-scale violent extremism. So, since September 11th, 2001, in fact, jihadists have killed a total of 107 people in the United States. And of course, remember, roughly 3,000 died on September 11th. So since then, a total of 107 people have died in this country as a result of jihad terrorist attack, and almost half of them were in one instance. You may remember the nightclub attack in Orlando, Florida, about 5 years ago, carried out by a single lone operator. But so over 20 years, while there has been some radical Islam terrorist activity in this country, it's been fairly minimal. And in fact, radical Islamic terrorism, says the FBI, has now been replaced by domestic white nationalist extremists as our country's greatest terrorist threat. So in that respect, regardless of what you think about the other outcomes and of being in Afghanistan and reasons for being there, but in that one respect, I think it would be difficult to say that the war was not a success, given that we have not seen another attack of that scale and scope over the last 20 years. But along with all the benefits that many see in leaving Afghanistan, what's also left are some very important emerging security challenges. A major challenge for the United States now is to decide whether to maintain diplomatic relationships with Afghanistan now that the Taliban are in charge. On one hand, having some voice and influence has obvious benefits, especially if there are still Americans and Afghani allies that we want to get out of Afghanistan after today. But the Taliban are a terrorist organization responsible for absolutely horrible human rights abuses. And many people argue that to officially recognize them is to minimize the importance of those abuses. Now, the Biden administration is saying right now, is that we will maintain no official presence in Afghanistan going forward. But it's hard to tell yet whether that's a temporary arrangement or a permanent one. But I guess the thing to do is to ask all of you what you think, Claire. If we can put up that next question. What do you think? Should the US recognize a Taliban-led government diplomatically? And there's three options here. One, yes, we should recognize a Taliban-led Afghan government because we need that relationship in order to protect our people and to help maintain stability in that region. Second, no, the US can't maintain diplomatic relations with terrorists. We don't have an official diplomatic relationship with Iran, of course, and with other countries around the world. We shouldn't with the Taliban. And then the third, this is sort of a wait and see option, is only if the Taliban commits to human rights and to fighting international terrorism. And if they hold up their end of the deal, backing up those promises, then maybe a diplomatic relationship with the US is a plausible outcome, but only if the Taliban makes and keeps those commitments. So let's see what our group has to say on this question, Claire. Very interesting. 58%, more than half of you, say this should be conditional. And that's roughly where the Biden administration, I think, is at this point, saying we'd like to reestablish diplomatic relationships, but only if you're willing to step up and behave in a more responsible manner. And we'll see going forward if that's the case. For the rest of you, a slightly larger number say we need to maintain that relationship even if the Taliban continues to act badly in the way we've talked about. And a slight margin over those who say no, simply we should not have that kind of relationship with terrorists. Now, the other challenge on these questions of diplomatic relations is that China and Russia, as I mentioned earlier, have already indicated their willingness to work with the Taliban-led government. So if the US chooses not to recognize the new leadership there, it creates opportunities for those two countries to expand their footprint and to expand their reach in a pretty critically important part of the world. The other difficulty is that the lack of a diplomatic or military presence for the US in Afghanistan makes it harder for us to develop intelligence assets. Remember, the question is, are we ready for another war on terror? And if we assume, as I do, that the Taliban coming back into power means that even if their terrorist aspirations are only local, that it increases the likelihood of other jihadists coming to that country and using it as a staging ground. And so that makes it even more important for us to maintain intelligence on what's going on within Afghanistan's borders. Now, last week, in the middle of all the chaos over the evacuation of Kabul's airport, the CIA destroyed what they call Eagle Base. And Eagle Base was the CIA's last outpost in Afghanistan. And with that destruction, about 20 years worth of intelligence gathering and counterterrorism operations just went up in smoke, literally. Now, without a base of operations or an embassy, American intelligence agents will have a much, much harder time working in Afghanistan. Now, because of drones and eavesdropping capability and other technological advances that have occurred over the last 20 years, technology will still give us some insight into what's going on inside of Afghanistan. But having human beings on the ground, developing and interacting with local sources is going to be much, much harder without an embassy, without a military operation, without any military bases, without any other structure in which our intelligence officers can work. So by way of context, the US State Department says that by their estimation, there are 72 terrorist groups in the world that that pose some level of threat, not just within their own borders, but beyond. Currently, right now, 18 of those 72 terrorist organizations operate out of either Afghanistan or Pakistan or both. So roughly 1/4 of all the large-scale terrorist activity in the world is now based in those two countries. But even as the withdrawal and the evacuation were taking place, that landscape was changing. It's estimated that between 8,000 and 10,000 foreign terrorist fighters have come into Afghanistan just over the last year since the Trump administration signed the withdrawal agreement with the Taliban. And that's according to a UN report that was released in June, which I would strongly recommend you. Now, most of these returning fighters are Taliban affiliated, but there's also a large number who support Al-Qaeda and ISIS who don't think the Taliban goes nearly far enough. And beyond those who came back from other countries, the majority of those released from Afghani prisons as a result of the agreement last year between the US and the Taliban, the majority of those released from Afghan prisons have al-Qaeda ties as well. And going forward, we shouldn't be surprised if more ISIS fighters come to Afghanistan for the same reason that they came to Iraq and Syria in the 2010s, because there was an opportunity there and a lack of either domestic or international oversight. Like I said, the Taliban doesn't have the finances or the infrastructure to completely quash ISIS on its own. And so what that means is the allure of coming back into some of the rural, less governable areas of Afghanistan for ISIS and al-Qaeda and others becomes stronger and stronger. Now, with the revival of al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, along with all the other threats that US intelligence agencies are dealing with, Iran, North Korea, Russia, China, so on, it's entirely possible that the United States could soon face renewed attacks on American soil. I don't think it's likely, but I do believe it's more probable based on our exit from Afghanistan. That said, just to calm you down a bit, I think there is a strong case to be made, and we can talk more about it in the second half of the program today if you like. There's a strong case to be made that even without that on-the-ground presence in Afghanistan, you can argue, and I believe, that the US is far better prepared to handle the threat of terrorism now than this country was before September 11th, 2001. And that's for reasons having not just to do with technology, but also with awareness and preparation. So the challenge is going to be more difficult going forward, but potentially more manageable. But make no mistake about it, the Biden administration, more than Trump, more than Obama, the Biden administration, like George W. Bush's administration, in addition to COVID, in addition to economic growth, to a large degree, Joe Biden's presidency will be defined by how well he handles the increased threat of international terrorism. If we are able to continue to avoid the type of large-scale attack that we have avoided since 2001, then along with those other factors, Biden in all likelihood will be judged as a success. But if we do see a large-scale terrorist attack within this country over the next few years, whether it's fair or not, many of Biden's critics, and I predict a majority of Americans, will see that terrorist attack as a result of the Afghanistan pullout. And the question remains and then the question becomes at that point, not just domestically, how it impacts Joe Biden's political fortunes, but whether another terrorist attack of that scale and scope would necessitate the United States going back into that part of the world in a much more forceful and visible way. Well, we didn't get to the recall. And the good news is, since we will talk about it next week, for those of you who are not in California, our recall election is taking place 2 weeks from today. So even though we didn't get to it today, given the tremendous import of the news out of Afghanistan, what I think is a very important discussion about the threat of international terrorism, we will get to it next week and be able to talk about that recall election in advance of it actually happening. So with that, Jessica, if you're still around, maybe we can expand this conversation and bring in some other voices and some other perspectives. What do you say?
Sounds good. I always like, are you still around? I'm like, nope, I just wandered away. I'm always here for you, Dan, and for our audience. So thank you so much. And yes, we've got a lot of great questions coming in. We did have one question about the election, or the recall. So maybe we can answer that quickly, and then we'll get to more of the Afghanistan questions. If the recall appears to be winning during early returns/results, could Governor Newsom resign in favor of the lieutenant governor before the final election results are certified, thereby negating the recall?
Well, the governor of California can resign at any time. The question is if resigning after voting had begun on election day would allow the recall to be called off. We do know that if Governor Newsom did resign before September 14th, that in all likelihood, the courts would decide that the recall was canceled because there have been no recall petitions signed against California's lieutenant governor, of course. But I think the decision would be a much more complicated one if he resigned while the vote was actually taking place on election day. I don't know what the courts would decide, but it's entirely possible that they would rule that once the process was underway, that Newsom's removal would no longer precipitate the lieutenant governor taking office, but rather that the recall process, having begun, would play out to its conclusion. So between now and September 14th, if Newsom went against every fiber of his being and every instinct that makes him who he is, did decide to resign, then at that point, I believe the recall probably, not certainly, but probably would be off, and the lieutenant governor would ascend to his office. If he were to consider waiting until the day of the voting, it's more probable than not that the courts would allow the vote to go forward, and his replacement would, if it passed, would be culled from those on the ballot as opposed to the LG.
Thank you. Should the Taliban not be concerned about the possibility of civil war in the coming months? If they harbor other terrorist groups, does that not pose a risk to the Taliban, such as a struggle for power?
This is a very complicated situation for the Taliban because ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other jihadist terrorist groups don't think that the Taliban is nearly doctrinaire enough. And so it's entirely possible that some of the Taliban's own most committed members might become frustrated with the government that they see as being overly accommodating to international interests and join up with some of the more radical groups. Even though it's not substantial at this point, there are still in the northern part of Afghanistan, the remnants, or I guess I should say the descendants of the Northern Alliance that were the United States' original allies when President Bush declared war on Afghanistan 20 years ago. And so there are parts of the northern part of that country that are certainly not under Taliban control, where the rebels still flourish. So whether it's more extreme jihadists on one side, whether it's Western aligned warlords on the other, this is a very volatile situation for the Taliban. And I suspect what they will do is move as quickly as they can to establish international partnerships with nations like Russia and China, if only to shore up their own standing within the country. But just because the United States is left, the questioner is exactly right. There's no guarantee whatsoever that the Taliban survives in power, because leading an insurgency is an entirely different skill set than maintaining control of and governing over an entire nation.
What about the former vice president of Afghanistan who is setting up a resistance to the Taliban?
Well, as I mentioned a moment ago, there is a resistance in the northern part of the country, and while the former president fled the country, his vice president has allied himself with the descendants of the Northern Alliance to try to mount some type of insurrection. They don't have nearly the military capability or strength now to mount a successful overthrow of the Taliban. But if a Taliban-led government were weakened for other reasons, like the ones we were talking about a moment ago, it's entirely possible that outside interests, if not the United States, other Western interests, could decide to provide support to provide support for them. So, like I said, the Taliban runs the Afghanistan government for now, but we don't have any idea how strong that is or how tenuous the hold is. And the former vice president's decision to align himself with the rebels in the northern part of the country is maybe not the greatest challenge the Taliban faces, but it's certainly in the top few.
Can you explain Trump's reason for working with the Taliban to end the war, and what were US expectations and demands? Or could you explain how Trump's refusal to share the negotiation with Biden may have culminated in the actions towards the USA departure?
Well, I don't know if Trump's decision not to share the details of the negotiation with Biden had much of an impact, because it's worth remembering that while Biden has been understandably and justifiably critical that the deal that Trump cut with the Taliban last year was a very, very unfavorable one for our interests, it is worth noting, as we talked about here in weeks past, that Biden has been a skeptic of ongoing U.S. military presence in Afghanistan since the early days of the Obama administration. So it's probable, not definite, but probable that President Biden would have moved in this direction regardless of what Trump had done. That said, the deal that the Trump administration did come to with the Taliban was incredibly one-sided. It asked the Taliban to make some fairly ethereal commitments about future terrorist activity and relationships within and dealings within the country. But it was very clear at the time, and even more clear now, that the Trump administration signed that agreement simply because they wanted to be out of Afghanistan, one way or another. Now, to be fair to both Trump or Biden, so do most of the American people. And what both of the last two presidents have seen, in addition to their own feelings about the advisability, or I guess I should say inadvisability, of continuing the war, is both were very aware about how strongly domestic U.S. public opinion was against staying in Afghanistan. So essentially, and I'm exaggerating but only slightly, the Trump administration agreed to give the country back to the Taliban, asking for almost nothing in return. And while Biden argues that at this point, had he reneged on the deal, it would have led to renewed military conflict between the U.S. and the Taliban, I think he would have ended up in this place regardless of whether Trump had signed that agreement last year or not.
Are you concerned about Americans left behind becoming hostages and being used in negotiations and constellations that we don't want to make with the Taliban?
I'm very concerned about how American nationals and our Afghani allies, those thousands and thousands of Afghani men and women who worked for the US, for the UN, and for other Western interests over the last 20 years. I'm not only very concerned for their safety, but I'm very concerned about the possibility of them being used as propaganda tools. Now, the US military commanders on the ground in Kabul said that if we had stayed, there's between 200 and 300 American citizens in Afghanistan who do want to get out, but for whatever the reason, either because they notified the military too late, because diplomatic efforts to find them took a long time, for whatever the reason, those last few hundred Americans were not able to get to the airport in time to leave. The American military commanders on the ground there said that if we'd stayed another week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, we still would have not been able to get all those American citizens out of the country. So they felt that extending the deadline would not be useful in that regard. Different people can come to different conclusions on that, that even if not all 300 or 250 Americans would have been removed with another week, if half of them or even a quarter of them would be, there are a lot of people who would argue that that would have been the smart decision to make. But regardless, between 200 and 300 Americans remain there, and all sorts of Afghan American allies, and the potential for them to be used as a propaganda tool to inspire and to motivate other jihadist movements in Afghanistan and around the world, I think is very, very strong. And it's one of the greatest, not just real world problems for the those unfortunate individuals who weren't allowed to leave, but it's a potentially devastating political problem for President Biden if any of those remaining individuals are used as hostages, are paraded in a certain way on a world stage, in a way that reflects poorly on him and on this country. So I agree with the questioner fully and completely.
This is kind of, you touched on this briefly, but how much lasting damage have Biden and the Democrats suffered in August, specifically the Afghanistan mess and the resurgence of COVID?
Biden has suffered a great deal of political damage, primarily as a result of Afghanistan, and that's reflected in public opinion polls. That's not my opinion. We can go through the polls in more detail next week, but Biden's support has slid noticeably over the summer, and the Delta variant surge certainly has not helped that. Whether it's lasting damage or not is a more complicated question. John Kennedy had the Bay of Pigs. Ronald Reagan had to deal with the massacre of the U.S. Marines in Lebanon. Most presidents face some type of crisis that doesn't reflect well on them. The question is whether by next November for the midterm elections or by 2024, this is an issue that will be front and center in the voters' minds, and we don't know the answer to that. The biggest potential difficulty for Biden, as we've talked about in previous weeks, is he ran for president, and in his first months as president, made it very clear that that the American people should trust him as someone who understood how government worked, and more specifically, who understood the importance of U.S. relationships around the world. And so his own credibility has taken a big hit on those fronts. But if we don't see a large-scale terrorist attack in this country, if progress is made on the coronavirus, and if Biden is able to pass some version of his infrastructure legislative package, and we see some economic benefit from it, the significant damage that he has suffered this summer doesn't necessarily have to affect either Democrats in midterm elections or his own reelection campaign in 3 years. It certainly could, but there's no reason to assume that this damage is lasting damage.
Withdrawing from Afghanistan has been a major campaign promise going back for years. What does it mean for either party that this is off the table now?
Well, I don't know that the withdrawal from Afghanistan is going to be all that relevant for either party going forward. What we're seeing more broadly, though, and Jessica, this is worth a topic on its own in a future week, is we're seeing the two parties to some degree remake themselves when it comes to U.S. engagement with the rest of the world. And for many decades, the old school Republican isolationists had largely been marginalized within their party. And the people who ran the Republican Party for the last several decades tended to be much more internationalist in their approach, militarily, economically, and diplomatically. We don't know yet whether that shift back toward isolationism is unique to Donald Trump's presidency or whether it's something that will continue going forward, given the new makeup of the Republican Party. But at least for now, and we're beginning to see just shards and pieces of this in the debate over Afghanistan, we're seeing the isolationist Republicans still, if not in absolute control of their party, still maintaining a very powerful voice. And similar shifts are taking place within the Democratic Party as well. Longer conversation for another day, but we see an immense split between the progressive and establishment wings of the Democratic Party on a number of domestic issues, but on all sorts of international policy as well. So I would say that unless there is a large-scale terrorist attack in this country, or the type of atrocities in Afghanistan that are so vast that it's impossible for the world to ignore, I don't think Afghanistan per se will be all that relevant an issue for either party in elections going forward. But the ramifications of the US withdrawal, whether it's in terms of national security or international relationships or anything else, are going to impact both parties in an immense way going forward. But as I said a few minutes ago, it's a much more complicated dynamic now than it was for most of the Cold War period. We're entering a very new time as it relates to US attitudes towards international involvement, and both of the parties grounding on these issues is much different than it's been in many, many years.
Thank you. We have several people sending in questions because we're talking about foreign terrorism, but also their concerns about domestic terrorism. So I'll take this one. You are talking about foreign terrorists attacking us on our soil, but domestic terrorism has grown and even thrived here since 2001. Why are we more concerned about the former than the latter? And do we have the same capacity to thwart both kinds?
Well, I don't know that we're more concerned about the former than the latter. Today's discussion, today's topic, sprang out of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. So it seemed to me it was fairly logical to talk about the potential specter of a renewed international terrorism threat as we saw before the US occupied Afghanistan. all those years ago. And so the question we address today is, does that vast open space in Afghanistan lend itself to a resurgence of Al-Qaeda or ISIS or other groups with international terror aspirations? But I mentioned in the opening half an hour that the FBI, among others, has designated white nationalist terrorism as a greater threat to the US than international jihadis are. And at least part of that, in my opinion, is a direct result of the US involvement in Afghanistan all these years. But the explosion, or at least the much larger threat of domestic-based terrorism, the questioner is exactly right, is immense, and it is something we should spend more time on, a standalone topic in the future. I think the questioner frames it in exactly the right way in asking, can we confront both terrorist challenges, both international and the now greater threat of domestic terrorism? And the answer is we can, but not with the same approach. And it's going to require a fundamental revamping of US intelligence. And it's going to require the FBI and CIA, who've had some pretty sharp elbows toward each other for most of the organization's existence, to find a way to work together as part of a broader anti-terror effort. Because what might work in thwarting terrorism emanating from Afghanistan or Iran or Syria is going to require an entirely different set of techniques than dealing with the rising domestic terrorism threat here. So yes, we can confront both, but they should be thought of as two separate and distinct parts of a broader overall strategy than a one-size-fits-all theory for fighting terror.
Apparently, Hamid Karzai, the first Afghan president after the American invasion, and Abdullah Abdullah, the kind of joint president with Ghani, are negotiating with the Taliban and may be part of the new government. Does this not show how very little we understand Afghan politics, and still do not? Surely we need to stay out of the way for a while and reassess our Afghan policy in a year or so when we have a better idea of what kind of government there is in Afghanistan.
Well, Karzai and Abdullah's willingness to work with the Taliban to form a coalition government, in my opinion, is actually an encouraging sign. The fact that the Taliban's entertaining those conversations rather than just rejecting them out of hand, to me, is some of the strongest evidence of the Taliban leadership's awareness of the challenges they're going to face of running this country, both domestic challenges and international ones. And they're very aware that having people like Karzai and Abdullah as part of their coalition is going to be of immense help to them on an international stage. So we'll see if it comes together or not, but it's one of the most important dynamics taking place within that country right now, and the questioner is exactly right to raise it. Does it reflect our lack of understanding of Afghanistan? Maybe, but there's 1,000, 5,000, 100,000 other factors that reflect our country's lack of understanding of Afghanistan. And one of the most frequent criticisms that we hear from both the left and the right is the lack of historical perspective that we brought to this, that we brought to this situation. Now, there are some who would argue, probably advisors to Biden and Trump and Obama and Bush, who would say, we were aware of what we didn't know about Afghanistan, but had no choice but to go in and stay under the circumstances. But whether you thought the US involvement in Afghanistan was the right thing to do or not, there's no question it would have been much to our benefit to have a better understanding of some of the cultural and societal dynamics that are unique to that country. But the counter to that is, by the time the United States could have developed that understanding and that capability, it could have been years after the original impetus to enter. So the questioner is correct. The U.S. and our representatives there didn't have a full understanding of the country, its history, or anything close to it. The unanswerable question is whether that's something that could have been handled differently at least on the immediate timeline that was required. Over 20 years, of course, there's a lot more time to develop that understanding. But in the moment in 2001, that might have been a less realistic question to ask.
You analyze the war on terror as at least somewhat successful because there have been no large-scale domestic terrorist attacks since 9/11, except for January 6th, but that's a different threat. However, worldwide Islamic fundamentalist terrorism is grossly larger, more widespread, destabilizing far more countries, and growing than it was on 9/11. Under that view, the war on terror has been a disaster. Isn't the real problem our 20-year over-militarization of the battle against terrorism, rather than taking a long-term approach that combines low-level counterinsurgency with diplomatic and intelligence efforts, along with support for democratic movements, with the realization that we can't eliminate all threats quickly? I know that was a long one.
My own opinion is that you need both, and you can't rely on either a solely militaristic-based effort, a solely diplomatic-based effort, or a solely cultural, societal, for lack of a better term, nation-based effort. You need to do all three. And one of the other criticisms that we've heard most about the US ongoing involvement in Afghanistan is that although our country originally went in order to minimize or to eradicate the Al-Qaeda's international terrorist capability, that ultimately our country stayed in order to try to build a democracy in the image of the United States, as the previous questioner correctly noted, in a culture that had no either had no history or cultural affinity for that type of approach. So yes, you need to do all of those things. And I think setting up any one of them as the sole path to success is a false choice. But I should clarify, because the core of the question was whether the war on terror had been a success or not. And I don't think, at least I didn't intend to imply, that the war on terror that this country's fought for 20 years has been a success. Rather, what I attempted to say was that the US's engagement and presence in Afghanistan, despite the obvious downsides, did prevent another large-scale terrorist attack on this country. And so by that measure, should be judged as success. Fairly, I'm not sure that you could argue that US involvement in Afghanistan or Iraq or Syria or anywhere is a sole contributing factor to the spread of worldwide of increased jihadist activity. The questioner is correct that increased US military presence does contribute to that, but I'm not sure that the spread of that ideology would not have occurred had the US not engaged militarily, because the counter argument to this is that when the United States retreats from a contested area, that presents a tremendous motivation to international terrorists. And that's the type of language that we're seeing out of Afghanistan right now. So I didn't mean to suggest that the war on terror had been a success. Far from it, for all the reasons the questioner mentioned and many, many more. But I think if you narrow back to the point that I was trying to make, not that a global war on terror had been successful, and at least not at the scale that we're talking about. If you're focused more specifically on the question of the US ongoing presence in Afghanistan, were tremendous downsides to that ongoing presence, but it did seem to prevent a recurrence of the September 11th terrorist attacks, which the majority of Americans expected would happen in the aftermath of 9/11.
The Patriot Act was put in place following 9/11 during the war in Afghanistan to look for terrorists. Do you think that will ever be lifted, or is it that once the government can surveil and monitor us more, they won't give up that power?
It's not going to be easy to remove some of that oversight authority from the federal government. There have been efforts made over the last several years, as most of you know, to scale back that type of oversight, what the government is legally allowed to do. Those efforts will continue, but I think they will be more difficult if the US government's leaders believe that there is a renewed threat of terrorist activity. So we've seen some very slow movement on this issue over many years. And that movement will continue because the further we get from the last large-scale terrorist attack, the more primacy many Americans will put on privacy over security. If there is another attack of that scale, and of course, like all of you, I hope and pray that it doesn't happen. But if it does, then that equation will shift back, because in the immediate aftermath of a threat to our security or a violation of our security, that's when many people will change their minds back and decide that that security is more important than privacy. So the longer we go without a terrorist attack, the more important privacy becomes. But I don't think that the pullout from Afghanistan, for all the reasons we've been talking about, is going to help move that debate further in the direction that the questioner is suggesting.
Won't Pakistan, India, Iran, China, and Russia exercise big influence over Afghanistan's government and oppose terrorists working from there?
Well, the first half of that question is exactly right. China, Russia, Iran, the other countries you mentioned, all for various reasons, have a very strong stake in Afghanistan, either for their own economic or security benefits or to marginalize the US presence in that part of the world. But terrorism isn't easily controllable, certainly not by diplomatic relations. And so on one hand, China, for example, will want stronger relationships with Afghanistan, and for that matter, with Pakistan, as a result of the recent events. There's no way to guarantee, as I said a little bit earlier in today's webinar, that Islam agitators on the Afghanistan-China border won't have some impact on the Uyghurs in Northwest China. Similarly, Russia wants to work with Afghanistan, but they're very, very wary about anything that might further motivate rebel movements in some of their client states in the region. So on one hand, we'll see all those countries to different degrees looking for ways to strengthen their relationships in hopes that it can minimize the possibility of terrorist activity or other types of violence on their borders. But there's no 100% guarantee there. And the challenge for the Taliban is, with or without international support, they have to find a way to suppress that terrorist activity if they do want to develop and maintain relationships with those countries. So this goes back to the very first question we talked about on this topic at the bottom of the hour. The Taliban's intentions and the Taliban's capabilities for governing Afghanistan are two very, very different things right now. And it's the difference between their goals and their ability to achieve those goals that to a large degree is going to define the answer to the last question.
Going forward for the state of Afghanistan's economy, what effect will the brain drain have on the Taliban's ability to provide essential services in healthcare, finance, infrastructure, and response to COVID for the average Afghanistan citizen?
Well, this is one of the greatest difficulties that the Taliban is facing right now. Like I said, there's a big difference between running an insurrection and even providing very basic government services as part of an insurrectionist movement and running an entire country. And the real difficulty for the Taliban right now is to try to convince those educated professionals to stay, so there will be a civic infrastructure in Afghanistan. The question is, how do you convince them to stay without making those who worked with the US in the past, without making those who represent ethnic and religious minorities, and what they do with women who occupy some of those professional roles. So on one hand, the Taliban is saying, we want you to stay and help us rebuild this country. On the other hand, a lot of the people who they need to stay the most are profoundly distrustful, for good reason, about what might happen to them if they stay. And I have to admit, I don't have a good sense at how successful the Taliban leadership will be in convincing that professional class to stay, because a more doctrinaire interpretation of the Islam faith, which the Taliban follows, is something that's very much anathema to many of the highly educated professionals, Muslims themselves. The Taliban needs to stay so badly.
Awesome. One last question, if I can get this one in. I think it's an interesting one. When we left Vietnam, we did not foresee the relationship we have today. Can we be realistically optimistic for a normal relationship with Afghanistan in the future?
Well, that's an easy question to answer. I have no idea. As we've talked about for the last 30, if not 60 minutes, we don't know where this country is headed. And even if we did know where it was headed, as the questioner correctly pointed out, there's no way of knowing 20, 30, 40 years from now if it'll continue in that trajectory or not. As the one thing I can say with some confidence in answer to the question is never say never, because we don't know what the future holds for our country, or certainly not for theirs. But it wouldn't be all that surprising if decades from now our relationship was in a fundamentally different place for reasons that none of us can envision right now. Long-winded way of saying I don't know, but that's one of my specialties. But I'm glad you asked it, Jessica.
Awesome. Well, to our audience, thank you so much. I know we had a ton of questions. We will focus on the recall election next Tuesday, and I know it is Rosh Hashanah, so we were trying to be mindful of timing and when people need to see family and go to temple. So hopefully you can join us. If not, it will be posted to our YouTube channel. So if you're not able to join us next Tuesday, we will send out that link so that people can check it out. Again, Dan, thank you so much for a wonderful discussion, and I look forward to seeing you next week.
Well, thank you, Jessica. Have a great week, and I'll see you next Tuesday.
Thanks.
Dan, you are remarkable for your expertise, and we so appreciate the time that you devote to helping us navigate through these very complex topics. So thank you so very much.
Well, thank you, Kim. As you know, I really enjoy it. I'm glad that our audience gets to gather with us once a week for these conversations.
They need it desperately. We can tell by the huge audience that follows you every week. I have a great lineup of programs just to share briefly with our audience. This Thursday, we have the first of two very, very important discussions on Afghanistan with a very impressive panel of experts and former ambassadors. So Thursday, September 2nd, the military response to Afghanistan. Part 2 will be on September 13th, the past, present, and future of U.S.-Afghanistan relations and foreign policy. Next Tuesday, Dan is back at his current time, 11 a.m., with politics in the time of coronavirus. September 9th, Power for All, how it works and why it's everyone's business. On September 14th, as Dan mentioned, we're moving him to the 5 p.m., almost prime time slot, so please mark that on your calendars. September 15th, the Remarkable Odyssey of Angela Merkel. And on September 23rd, The Future of Money with Frank Motek of KABC Radio. Some of you will remember him from KNBC as well. So please go to our website, register today. You can also view all of our past live streams. You can renew your membership, sign up to become a member, or make a donation. We can't do this without your support. Everybody, please stay safe, stay informed, and we hope to see you Thursday. Dan, thank you again. See you next Tuesday.
Thanks again, Kim. Thanks, everybody.